want to welcome everybody today. My name is Ken Jackson, and I am the Chief Client Officer at Sliced Health. Um, and today we're going to talk about a topic that is pretty high on everybody's list of things to understand, and that is price transparency. Specifically, the rules and regulations have changed recently, and I think there's a lot of confusion about it. And so maybe we can take some time to talk through it, hopefully kind of clarify some of the rules, what may apply and what may not apply, depending on how you're putting together your price transparency files in the machine readable. So with that, let's kind of get started. Again, as I stated, there seems to be a lot of confusion. I always start my conversations about price transparency to remind everybody how we got to the place that we are. So, the rule itself in the executive order was issued way back in 2019. And the first actual compliance piece where CMS began to review for compliance was in 2021. And we've had a lot of changes since that very first executive order that was signed by Donald Trump in 2019. A lot of confusion happened this year because we actually got two different things that happened. An executive order at the first of 2025, which was really nothing more than, I think, Donald Trump being back in office and saying, I've looked at price transparency and what's happened over the last 4 years, and I'm not happy with the fact that so many hospitals are still not in compliance. And we are not really accomplishing what I intended when I signed that executive order. So his executive order in early of 2025 was more around making sure that the agencies responsible for compliance, like CMS, would put together a plan of how they would go about making sure that they audit hospitals for compliance, make sure that compliance is something better than what it had been in the past, which was around 50%, and get it closer to 100%, and expected that plan by mid-year. So what happened next was in July, we began to get a feel for what that was going to look like. And so not only was there a plan around compliance and how they were going to enforce, but there was also a couple of new things that were being added to the compliance picture and how to make a machine readable file compliant. And so that's where we're at today. And those rules that came out in July, they were basically waiting on, like most government things, a period of time where people could comment, ask questions, they could change that final ruling. And the intent, I think, for them was to get that final ruling out in October. And unfortunately, we had a government shutdown. And during that shutdown, that delayed that coming out. So you may be aware now that there are new compliance rules that are in force right now. They started on January the 1st, but from an auditing and holding people accountable and beginning to fine people for non-compliance has been delayed until April the 1st because they were late getting the final rule out. And so no one really knew what that looked like until around November 22nd, that week. So let's go over what the rules are. The fundamentals that you probably already know. You have to have a machine readable file. And that machine readable file is basically a copy of your charge master with negotiated rates for all the charges in it. So if you have a contract where you have negotiated a rate, that has to be in the machine readable file and available. There are some specifics around that sometimes confuse people even today. So let me tell you what a negotiated rate isn't and what doesn't have to go in the file. That may be the easiest. That is a state Medicaid plan that is going directly to the state, or a traditional Medicare that is going directly to CMS for payment. Those are not considered negotiated rates. Those are governmental programs with specified rates. And I think the intent is that people on those programs can go and get the information they need from CMS or from the state. So what does that mean for a Medicare Advantage plan? Well, that is a negotiated rate because you have a contract with United, who is now going to adjudicate claims as if it was CMS, but it's not, right? The Medicare Advantage plan is a little bit different. So those are considered negotiated rates, things that you would see with Humana, with United. Those are probably the largest. Blue Cross is operating in a lot of places. State Medicaid programs have MCOs where they have given out to insurance companies the ability to adjudicate claims, similar to the Advantage plans. So any of those where you're working with a payer like a Molina, or maybe it's Scott and White in the state of Texas, someone like that who's administering the program, and you had to sign a contract with them in order to file claims with them and be a network, those are considered negotiated rates. So again, it's going directly to the state, it's going directly to CMS. It doesn't need to be in the machine readable file. If it's through an insurance company and a contract with them, that is considered a negotiated rate and has to be there. The other thing that is true inside that file that really creates a headache, I think, for most people in trying to maintain it themselves is in January of 2025, there was a compliance feature that was added where you had to have specific information on all pharmacy items in your charge master, had to be included. And those items were an NDC number. It was also the unit of measurement that you were dosing it out at, as well as the actual dose itself. So, for instance, NDC number that is coming as you're purchasing, and it actually changes every time you purchase the drug. But one of the rules for price transparency, you only have to update the file once a year. So it is a static reference to the NDC number at the time you put the machine readable file out there. Now, the measurements are also an issue because they need to be discrete data elements. Plenty of people had discrete data elements inside their description. So I'm going to give Tylenol at 500 milligrams. And everybody thought, well, that's good enough. But it's not, because it needs to be discrete. So the 500 has to be in a discrete field. The milligrams has to be in a discrete field. And in some cases, there has to be some conversion, because CMS only recognizes, I can't remember right now off the top of my head, but it's 7 or 8 specific unit measurements. And so some things need to be converted to 1 tablet or 1 unit or 1 each. And that created a lot of issues at the beginning of the year last year. The other thing that made that difficult is all those elements that are related to an actual drug are not normally found in a charge master. They are found in a formulary. That means that now I have to pull a formulary from my pharmacy system, a charge master from my revenue cycle system, and now I have to merge them. And so that was another specific issue, and is still an issue today, because that hasn't gotten any better. That is still the case. Those things are housed in two different places. And so having to merge those things can be difficult. But you have to have them in order to be compliant. The other things that are there is specific formatting. So obviously you have to have your charge items there. You have to give information on rev codes, CPT codes, HCPCS codes, the NDC number, all those kinds of things, as well as those measurements that we talked about. What is the actual charge for an item? What is the negotiated rate for the specific insurance and plan? And then you also have to give information on how you calculated that. So it can't just be, I'm going to charge 200 and my negotiated rate is 150. You have to give the information on how you calculated 150. So if that's 75% of charge, that would be one way. If it's 100% of the Blue Cross fee schedule, that would be another way to describe how that's happening. But those elements need to be in the file in order to be compliant. Then you have a couple of ways to put things into the file. And as far as a negotiated rate, I think the intention of CMS, and I think the way that they gravitate, is that they would prefer for them to be actual negotiated rates from a contract. However, they have made some exceptions so that if you use an algorithm to go back and review all of your claim remits to estimate what that negotiated rate is, you can do that. So there is an estimated rate and there is a negotiated rate column. The reason why this is important is because one of the things that changed on January the 1st of 2026 is what happens if you are not using a negotiated rate, but instead of you're using an estimate. The rationale that was given was that we know that there is volatility in your payment rate if you're making if you're using an algorithm to create that number, because what you're getting is an average. So maybe you run all the data for a year on a specific charge code and you discover that on average UHC pays you $500. And that's what you put as the estimated rate. But sometimes you got paid $200 and sometimes you got paid $800 and you're just giving an average. So they came up with a new rule. And the new rule is what most people refer to as a 10-50-90 rule. So you're having to, if you're using an estimate like that, give them the information on the lower 10%, the median price, and the upper 90% that you get paid. So that in theory, you can see the volatility of that pricing and of the algorithm. If you're using a negotiated rate, and this is key, and I would say this actually applies to our clients at Sliced Health, because this is the way we put our file together, is we do everything off of a true negotiated rate. It is based on a contract. It is based on the fee schedules for that contract. So we are not guessing. We are actually pulling from what you signed with an agreement, whether it's Blue Cross or United, whoever that insurance is. In those instances where it is a true negotiated rate, there is, in theory, no volatility because you are reporting exactly what you signed for. So the 10-50-90 rule doesn't apply in those cases. There is a lot of confusion around that. There was a lot of confusion for us when we started trying to figure out what compliance looked like. And so we did something that I knew that we could do, but we hadn't in the past. And that is, we had a lot of conversation with CMS and a lot of communication back and forth to try to nail down when does the 10-50-90 rule apply, if I'm using negotiated rates directly from a contract, do I really have to do that? And the answer is, regardless of how you do it, you have to have the format for it, but you only fill in the 10, 50, 90 if you're using an estimated amount. So in our case with negotiated rates, that doesn't apply. So if you're doing it that way, you're fine to not have to go back and do all of that research on your remits and figure that volatility out and report it. That's a key element, and it's one that a lot of people are confused about in this moment. The other change that was made a year ago, they added an attestation to the machine readable file. So there had to be an attestation that basically, without giving you exact wording, basically said, hey, we did the best we could to provide our charges as of this date and our negotiated rates for this date. And here it is. And so there's an attestation that's there. What has changed on January the 1st of 2026 is that now the attestation in the file has to also include the name of the person attesting. And so that is another element that needs to be in place in this moment. Everything else in that machine readable file is really the same. The big change is that 10, 50, 90 rule for this year, as well as the name of the attestation or the person doing the attestation. There are other elements other than the machine readable file that create compliance. And so I don't want to miss that. The machine readable file is what CMS is reviewing for compliance for the most part, but there are other elements. We know, for instance, we have to have shoppable services available for patients to look, identify, hey, I'm coming in for a service. Let me see if I can find this. What are you going to charge me? What is my insurance going to allow? There are also some other elements to that, right? What is the lowest amount that I negotiated? What is the highest amount I negotiated? What is the cash price if I don't have insurance? All those data elements have to be included in those shoppable services. And I talk about it in terms of 300, meaning the standard is you have to have 300 shoppable services, but do know that 70 of those are required. If you do the service, you have to include it in those 300. So let's assume you did all 70. That means you get to pick the other 230. If you only do, let's say 20 of the 70, well, now you got to pick 280. There is no rule that says it has to be exactly 300. It just has to be a minimum of 300. I think other elements that sometimes people get tripped over is that the link to your price transparency solution has to be in the footer of your website. So there has to be something that clearly defines price transparency there. If it is not there, you will be considered non-compliant. There also is the issue of the text file that has to be included in your website, and that goes in the root directory of your website. I usually refer to it as a .txt file, but it's got a very specific name and is the same for every hospital. It is cms-hpt.txt. And I have to be able to go to your website, put a slash cms-hpt.txt and get a file that gives me 5 data elements. And if I don't get that file, you're non-compliant. So that is one of those things that can be difficult depending on how you do your website. Usually people who are doing it internally don't have issues, but if I farm that out, sometimes it can be fun to try to get that file placed. The elements that are in that file include the name of the hospital. It will include the address, the web address, if you will, of your price transparency tool. It will include the static address where you are housing your machine readable file. It will include the name of the person that should be contacted if there's an issue or question, and their phone number. So those are the elements that are there. For the most part, that person that's been there for, that requirement's been there for around a little over a year. That person is probably the same person. If you remember me talking about the attestation, it's probably the same person whose name's going to appear in the file now, attesting to the accuracy of the file. There's one other element that comes up on a fairly regular basis, and that is the date on the machine readable file. I mentioned it earlier, I think, when we were talking, but you have to update your ChargeMaster and your machine readable file once a year. So if CMS goes and scrapes your website to pull that static machine readable file, they're one of the very first things they're going to look at is the date. So, you know, if they pull a date and it is over a year old, you are out of compliance and you will get a letter. The reason why this may become an issue is because you may not think you need to republish your machine readable file, because I didn't do any price increases. I didn't really make changes in my ChargeMaster, but they are keying off of that date. So even if you haven't made changes, you at least need to change that date in the file in order to stay compliant. Now, probably the next question that I get is, what's it going to cost me if I don't do this? And there are definitely fines. And I would say with the current administration, that they will be far more aggressive. That was the point of what happened last January. We are going to make sure you maintain compliance. So here's what I want to kind of convey in this moment, and that's the fines that are out there today and how it applies to hospitals, because it is tiered, depends on the size of the hospital, the size of the fine. So let's start with the smallest of small. So any hospital with 30 or fewer beds can receive a maximum fine of up to $300 per day that they are not in compliance. That's the way they think of that in terms of finding that group and trying to maintain a lower tier, if you will, recognizing that, you know, finding a small hospital, $3 million isn't probably going to be helpful. It's definitely punitive, but it also probably puts that hospital out of business. The next tier that they talk about is the 31 bed to 550 bed range. And in that particular case, those maximum fines are $10 per bed per day that you are out of compliance. So if you think about it from that perspective, if you're a 500 bed facility, that's $5,000 a day. So much more significant for that size facility, which makes sense. And then you have the largest of large, the 550. And in those particular moments, the fine is $5,500 per day. So it's definitely meant to be punitive. It is definitely meant to get people to take it serious and to make sure that they are compliant. Again, I think my advice in this moment is I would take this administration serious. I think that over the 4 years earlier, we got used to hearing statistics about 70% of the hospitals aren't compliant, 50% of the hospitals aren't compliant, but there was really no enforcement. As a matter of fact, during that time frame, there were only 28 hospitals fined. I think if 50% of the hospitals are non-compliant this year, you could probably expect every one of them to be fined. I think I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of leeway in the enforcement, and I think that's probably what I would take home from the announcements earlier in 25 from the president and that executive order. Hopefully, I've gone over things in a way that makes it easier to understand compliance, what it is, and maybe some of the nuances that a lot of people get hung up on, especially in the current environment and the brand new compliant features in the machine readable file. I just want to reiterate those items as of January the 1st, 2026. Technically, you are non-compliant if you don't have those items there. However, enforcement doesn't start until April the 1st. So you do have a little bit of time right now to go and review those things and make sure that you get in compliance before you do start getting what I call a nasty gram from the government telling you to fix it. Thank you.